אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השירה הזאת לאדוני. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Eternal One. This is how the song we heard this morning is introduced before it launches vigorously into a hymn of triumph and victory, drawing on the imagery of Canaanite and Ugaritic mythology. Scholars and commentators have frequently seen the poem as Moses' song, the first of two of Moses' songs, one marking the beginning of his role as Israel's leader, here that we've just read, the other marking the end of his leadership at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. But is it correct to see Shirat Hayam, the song at the sea, as Moses' song? Is it consistent with what we know about these kinds of victory songs? True, the chapter begins, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Eternal One. But what if an editor added these words at a later time? What if it was somebody else's song, but its authorship was removed, its true authorship removed, and attributed instead to the more significant male character in the story of Exodus? It is not unknown for works of women to be attributed to male authors. In the 12th century, the books of Trota of Salerno, an Italian physician, were attributed to male writers. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there are several examples of women who, despite their discoveries as physicists, geneticists, and chemists, are overlooked, their work credited to male colleagues. In 1944, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was given to Otto Hahn, while Lisa Meitner, who had laid the theoretical foundations for nuclear fission, a term which she had coined, was not recognized, partly due to her gender and partly to her persecuted Jewish identity in Nazi Germany. Rosalind Franklin is another example of a woman who was not properly credited for her contribution to the 1953 discovery of DNA structure. Two men received the 1962 Nobel Prize at the time of her discoveries. I wonder whether Moses' Song of the Sea is not his work at all, but the poetic work of his sister Miriam. What if the last few verses that refer to Miriam, the prophetess, leading people in song, were originally the title and introduction to the longer song? What if they were removed by an editor and pushed to the end of the song as a kind of little afterthought, or we'll push her in there, a kind of epilogue? This is not a fanciful leap of imagination. Both the long version and short version of the song begin with an introduction. The long version begins, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song. There are no further details, and we are left with the question, did Moses actually compose and sing this song with the Israelites? Is there any precedence for men composing and singing these songs of victory? If we discount the Psalms, which are very personal, intimate prayers to God, and leave out the Levites who sang in the temple, we are left with little or no evidence of men singing victory songs. On the contrary, it is women who are named as composers, instrumentalists, singers, and performers of these kinds of song. emerging from their homes to greet soldiers returning from battle. Miriam is named here. She is accorded the title of Neviah, prophet, prophetess. She is Aaron's sister, and the details given here are consistent with other descriptions of women's songmakers. She takes up her hand drum, and followed by all the women, she leads them in dance with their hand drums and chants the verses that follow. Shiru l'Adonai, ki ga'o ga'a, sus v'rochvo, Rama vayam. Sing to the Eternal One, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. There is a little difference between Miriam's opening word, shiru, and the opening word of the longer version, ashira. The latter, ashira, means I will sing to the Eternal One. The fragment at the end is a plural imperative, shiru, sing to the Eternal One. Miriam's song is a call to all the women to sing, in the tradition of all women who welcomed victorious armies with victory songs, who were accomplished musicians, who would perform for special occasions with singing and playing of hand drums. Some scholars have argued that Miriam's much shorter version is simply an antiphonal response to Moses' longer song, a version that repeats the opening line, as it were. He sings the main number. She gets to sing a little refrain at the end. But Professor Carol Myers, drawing on the work of earlier scholars, draws our attention to a set of fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated between 75 and 50 BCE, which include 7 incomplete lines that have survived as Miriam's song, separate from that of Moses. The fragments capture the majesty and power of God, who does gloriously and performs majestically. We are left with the question, did there perhaps exist a longer version of Miriam's song, which was expunged from the texts that were included in the Hebrew Bible? Professor Myers goes further, pointing out a number of considerations that support the possibility from a traditional historical perspective that the poem, the long poem, was Miriam's before it was Moses. She argues that the text is not altogether clear that it is Moses' song at the beginning. It refers to Moses and the Israelites, but it doesn't say his song. Nor should we assume, she says, that the verb that introduces Miriam's song at the end, vata'an, means she answered. It could and is more likely to mean she chanted, or as the Septuagint translates the Hebrew, she led them in song. She draws on the work of 2 biblical scholars who assert that the long hymn in Exodus 15 should be designated the Song of Miriam, because the ascription to Miriam at the end of our reading is more detailed and therefore more superior than any ascription to Moses. The longer poem was simply reattributed to Moses, the leader of the Israelites. The tradition of Miriam's authorship of the poem is so strong that it cannot be ignored. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the evidence that Miriam led the women in song, that this was the profession of women in ancient times, all point towards her authorship, her composition, her performance of the song. Nearly every example in the Hebrew and post-biblical literature record women singing songs of victory. In the book of Judges, Jephthah's daughter emerges from his house to greet him with a hand drum and dancing as he returns from his military victory. When the troops return from battle in the book of Samuel, and David returns from killing the Philistine, the women of the towns of Israel come out singing and dancing to greet King Saul with hand drums and with the words, "Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands." And in Judges chapter 5, Barak calls to Deborah, "Awake, awake, O Deborah, strike up the chant." And Professor Myers lists other examples in Jeremiah, in the apocryphal book of Judith, where women take up a role of performance at key events with singing, dancing, and words of song. These genres were specifically associated with women. Women, says Professor Myers, are the ones left behind when armies go out to battle, and thus they are the ones to celebrate the return of warriors. In its ancient cultural context, the Song of the Sea would have been sung by women, Miriam and her cohort, celebrating God's defeat of Israel's enemies. In fact, from the accounts of Miriam, Deborah, Jephthah's daughter, and Judith, we get a picture of women as leaders of musical groups. Miriam suffered the fate of many women whose work has either been overlooked or credited to men. Fanny Mendelssohn is another example, the sister of Felix Mendelssohn, of a musician overlooked by a world who felt it was unseemly for married women to be composers or performers, and she was overshadowed by her brother. So did an editor come along at some later time, remove the attribution of the song to Miriam, place it at the end with a short refrain, and add Moses' name at the opening of the poem. Perhaps he thought, a song at the beginning of Moses' leadership and a song at the end, that would be a nice symmetry. But then he forgot about the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. This poem, says Professor Myers, forms the literary function of enveloping the first major section of the book of Exodus within women-centered texts, from the 12 women who figure prominently in the opening chapters of Exodus: Shiphrah, Puah, Moses' mother and sister, Pharaoh's daughter, and the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian, to the ringing words of Miriam in Exodus 15. The Song of Miriam, the full-length song, with all its noisy and glorious triumphant imagery, and the relegation of its composer's name to a few verses at the end, reminds us that there are some battles that are not yet won. Anyone glancing at the website of the movement known as Everyone's Invited will be appalled by the tens of thousands of testimonies, mostly by women, some by men, university students, employees, and overwhelmingly by children, girls and boys at school, who have been violated and abused in unspeakable ways. These are testimonies that are very difficult to read. The overwhelming majority are by women and girls whose dignity, innocence, and trust have been grossly betrayed. Many have been traumatized and have had nowhere to turn for help. They bring home a message that there is something deeply wrong in the perception of women and girls. Not universally. We cannot condemn all men and boys, but we can enlist them in our earnest endeavour to eradicate rampant misogyny and see women not as objects, but as the empowered authors, composers, and singers of their own songs. The song of Miriam reminds women everywhere not to be afraid, to find courage and resilience, and to be and become the individuals that they alone wish to be, and to sing the song that rightly belongs to them.